especially regarding, say, like free speech, which I'm sure Ayn Rand philosophy is a proponent of.
Yeah, we've actually been, I would say, we've been on the barricades of defending free speech since the Salman Rushdie thing in 1989. I don't know if you know much about that case, but
I don't actually.
It's sort of we can talk more about it, but we've been absolutists about free speech for that basically almost 30 years. Yeah.
I mean, what are your thoughts on the state of free speech today? I mean, obviously we have these platforms that allow people to voice their opinions unlike they have never been able to before, which is a good thing. But then at the same time, I feel like there's been more repercussions for voicing your opinions like there never has been before.
Yeah,
in America anyway.
I think people are talking more, so they're saying more things. And for some silly people, for people making silly mistakes or bad choices, they're creating more traps for themselves maybe, and it's easier to find their thoughts from when they were 17, and now that it's being held against them as adults. I think America, I think, has probably the best protections for freedom of speech of all countries. It has the First Amendment, which is a huge protection. I don't think many countries have anything close to that kind of formal protection. I am very concerned about free speech, partly for the reason you raised, which is there's a kind of almost like a hunting party mentality of finding people who are offensive and trying to either shut them down or marginalize them. And there's been some really horrendous cases. You might have heard about the professor at Evergreen State University.
Bret Weinstein.
Right. And we did an event with him a few months back, and his story is really tragic. I mean, he had a reasoned position. You don't have to agree with it. But he was hounded out of his job.
He was literally hunted down on campus, and they told him, if I have the story correct, the campus police called him that day and said, "Don't come on campus. We've been told not to protect you." And they're looking for, the mob, the student mob, are looking for you.
Yeah. And there's so many of these examples which are, now I don't know there's lots of examples. I don't know the scale of the problem in terms of its presence on campus, but I think there are enough high level examples that it's worrying. So the other one that made news around the same time was Charles Murray going to Middlebury College, I believe, and getting not only hounded, but sort of chased off campus for his views. Now, I don't know enough about Charles Murray's views to tell you what I think of them. The guy was invited to speak. This is not the way to engage with ideas. So I have concerns about people's attitudes to free speech. And for me, the fundamental problem is people don't understand what free speech is. And so that leads to both attacks on people who they disagree with, but also very bad defenses of freedom of speech. So I'll give you sort of the kernel of the idea. My view is freedom of speech means you have an absolute right to speak your ideas using your resources, so long as you're not violating someone's freedom or violating their rights, which means no one owes you an audience and no one should be stopping you from finding an audience. If you rent a hall and you want to give a speech, you can say what you want in that speech, but you can't then say something. You can't use your freedom of speech to violate someone's rights by libeling them, by slandering them, by threats. Yeah, definitely. If you're inciting someone to crime, then you're committing a crime. That is a violation of someone's freedom. That's not part of free speech. That's not what you're legitimately entitled to do. What you are legitimately entitled to do is to express your thoughts in writing, in speaking, in film, in radio, whatever medium you choose to use, regardless of how someone else finds it, whether it's offensive or appealing or humorous or not humorous. And that's a huge part of what people don't understand. So I understand when people are offended by my views, because I'm offended by other people's views all the time. I mean, I read New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, and I'm offended every day. But that's not a reason for me to try to stop someone from speaking. And I might not want to engage with them. I might morally walk away and say that you guys are beyond the pale. Like, there's definitely cases where you shouldn't support people. You should say, you're a bigot, you're a white supremacist, I have nothing to do with you. But that's different from, do they have a right to speak, given their resources and given that they're not violating freedom? So it's different from offensiveness, right? That's something that's very subjective. It's a real thing.
Right.
And if you're a professor, it's something to think about. Like, your goal as a professor is to engage your students, not turn them off. But even there, so people don't understand freedom of speech, and there's a kind of emotionalism in our culture about it. And you see that with college students. I have a very small example to share with you. So it's nothing like what happened to Bret Weinstein, nothing like Charles Murray, not even on the same level, but the smallness of it is illustrative. So we had an event at UCLA Law School. I wasn't actually speaking at the event, but some of my colleagues had one of my books on display. And the book is about America's response to 9/11 during the Bush and Obama years. And the title of the book is Failing to Confront Islamic Totalitarianism. Now, that doesn't, from that, how much do you know about my view? Just from the title.
I would assume you have some thoughts on Islamic totalitarianism.
I have some thoughts on it, and I have lots of essays in this book. Now, what happened at UCLA Law School is the book was on display for sale, and a number of students came along, and from the title and maybe like 10 seconds of Googling, they decided the book could not be allowed on the campus.
Wow.
So they created a ring around the table. They tried to block...
Like a human ring?
Yes.
Wow.
They tried to knock the books over. And eventually an administrator from UCLA Law School came along and the students complained to the administrator. And the administrator said, the book has to be put away. You cannot have this book on display. So I complained. I wrote an article about it, and I connected with some professors who are on the faculty, and they were good about this because they recognized this is not right. This is not the way to deal with this. But what alarmed me most, right? It was a very small thing, right? What alarmed me is the students' attitude was not, we know what you're about and we disagree with you, here are the arguments. It was, we don't like what you have to say. We don't even need to know what you have to say. The title's enough. We find it threatening. It's offensive.
It's hate speech.
Yeah. It was, I can't remember exactly what they said, but it was something like they felt threatened by the title of the book.
Wow.
And my attitude to that is go to the university library where you are enrolled and look through the stacks. There are a lot of titles that you'll be offended by, and that's part of what it means to be in a university. You're there to learn. So fortunately, unlike a lot of these cases, the administration at UCLA Law School was really good. They recognized that they didn't follow their own policy. It was not the right call to make the book, to take it off from sale. And they apologized for it. And I really respect them for doing that. But they stand out, in my view, in the culture for having the integrity of saying, no, that we actually think this is not the way to handle this sort of thing, just to appease the students' emotions. And you see there's one or two other universities that are showing a degree of it's kind of a principled approach. I think University of Chicago had a statement about a year ago saying, this is what we expect of our students. This is our attitude to freedom of speech on campus. That's the kind of thing that I wish there were more of. But to get that, I think you need real philosophic understanding of what free speech is about. And then there are definitely hard cases. And I mean, we can... This one of the books my colleague put out, it's called Defending Free Speech by Steve Simpson. And I have a very small contribution now, which I'm proud of.
Hey.
Because I believe I'm a free speech absolute, and I've become even more so over the years, seeing how it's being threatened, not only on campus, which I think is its own kind of problem, but also, we talked earlier about Fleming Rose. So his fame the source of that was the Danish cartoon crisis. And I've met him, he's one of my heroes. To me, that's the other kind of threat, the actual physical threat of people trying to stop us from speaking about a topic that they don't like hearing about. And that is I'm talking about the Islamists who put Fleming Rose on a kill list. There's an Al-Qaeda hit list that's published, and he's on there. So is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and a number of people that you will have heard of. And these are people who are putting their lives on the line in order to say what they believe needs to be said. And it's not... What Fleming Rose says is, we need to deal with the problem that there are people who in the name of Islam are fighting to kill us, right? That's all he's saying. And that's important. And he opposes, and I oppose, the idea that we should, in quotes, self-censor ourselves, which is not really self-censorship, right? We don't want to be killed, so we're not going to say certain things. That to me is, the problem with that is both the jihadist movement or intellectual movement that is pushing for that in Europe and across the world, not only that they're the aggressors in this, but also the default of our government. So what makes this possible is that the government isn't standing up and saying, no, free speech is an absolute. These people have no right. We're going to protect you if you say this. And we saw this numerous times. I mentioned the Salman Rushdie case from 1989. So the story in brief is he wrote a novel. He's a British novelist. And through various machinations, the Iranian regime decided that he has to be killed. So they put a bounty on his head and said every Muslim anywhere who has the opportunity should go out and try to kill him. And some tried to kill him. And they went after bookshops in the US and the UK.
So he was in the US?
Well, no, his publisher was in the US and his book was sold here. So they came after him. And so the fatwa that Ayatollah Khomeini issued was not only against Salman Rushdie, but everyone involved in the book's publication.
Wow.
So sellers and publishers. So there were firebombs at bookshops. People were selling the book to the extent they were brave enough, but only under the counter. And there were places where they put up signs in the window, we don't stock the Satanic Verses, which is the name of the novel, because they feared they're having their shop windows smashed. So this happens in 1989. You get the Danish cartoon crisis in 2005, 2006. And again, what happens is there's no real response to it. So what happened with the Rushdie case was replicated. At the time, George H.W. Bush said, maybe he shouldn't have written that book. And instead of saying, no, we believe freedom of speech is an absolute. And then what happens during the Danish cartoons is George W. Bush, his son, when he's in power, has essentially the same attitude, which is, we're not in favor of offending the Muslim religion. Nobody's in favor of offending them. What we want is the freedom of speech for being able to publish cartoons.
Yeah.
And then you see this cascading through after the Danish cartoons to the point where there is a real culture in Europe, especially, and I think it's coming to our shores, where people are afraid to talk about this issue, whatever their view is, right? They don't want to stick their neck out because they know they won't get the kind of protection that they should. And I think that's a default of government's function. Now, some countries are better at this than others, but I think America has a huge default, and that has worked against us, right? It's encouraged that kind of attitude of demanding that we, in effect, obey these religious rules about blasphemy. And so, I mean, if you remember the incident in Garland, Texas, there was a cartoon contest, Draw Muhammad, and they were handing out the prizes for that. And two jihadists essentially showed up with guns, and they were there to shoot up the place, except they were stopped before they managed to do it. So it creates this kind of climate.
I don't remember that. I can't.
Yeah, it happened just after the Charlie Hebdo shootings in 2015. And of course, Charlie Hebdo was sort of the turning point for, okay, this is a magazine that's transgressed every boundary, right?
Yeah. Christians, right? Jews, I'm just assuming everyone.
Everybody. They went after the Pope. They went after Jews. They went after atheists. They go after everyone. And I never read Charlie Hebdo, but I bought a copy after they were assassinated. Now, to me, it's a double crisis, right? It's this movement of jihadists who want to enforce their religious views on us and in effect, destroy freedom of speech. And the failure to respond to that properly on the part of government. So I'm concerned about free speech for all those different kinds of dimensions, both on campus and from the material threat. And I wish that, what happened recently, the number of editorial boards around the country wrote editorials all in unison saying, we regard the Trump administration as a threat to the free press. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's this whole concern about him regarding the press as an enemy of the state, which I think is horrendous as a view. Now, I wish all the journalists in this country and all of the magazine publishers stood up and said, I'm Spartacus, at the time of the Danish cartoons crisis, at the time of Salman Rushdie, at the time of Charlie Hebdo, and put out a similar statement in unison and saying, we stand for the absolute protection of freedom of speech. But let me ask you, after the Danish cartoons crisis, after Charlie Hebdo, how many of those cartoons did you see reprinted anywhere? They weren't shown on TV. They weren't shown in the best example of this is there was an academic book about the cartoons crisis that came out around 2009, an analysis of the crisis, the origin, the theology of it. And for fear of being firebombed or worse, the publisher decided at the last minute not to include any of the images, any of those cartoons in the book that is written about them. So just think about how crazy that is. Like you're writing about these cartoons, you fear the risk of publishing them. And I think so there's a small part of this, which is the press hasn't stood up, I think, and demanded better protection. I hope I hope they get better at this, because I don't think the trend is going to change unless we do stand up to it.
And the reasoning for all this from, I guess, the Islam's side is that they're not allowed to, or they say no one should be allowed to depict Muhammad at all. Is that right?
That's part of it. But it's important. So that's sort of the headline level answer to it. But the truth of it was that in the Danish cartoons crisis, it was manufactured. There were a number of Danish imams who demanded of their own government that they punish the newspaper in Denmark that published them originally. And when they didn't get their satisfaction, they went to the Middle East and they showed some of the actual cartoons and then some other cartoons that they came up with and tried to inflame the governments in that part of the world to rile up people into rioting. And that was a large part how it spread. There were people who rioted who had never seen the cartoons. Right. So this was a big part of it was the agitation against the idea of free speech, which was not an honest concern. Like if you had established doctrine that you can't do this, I would understand there would be some semblance of reason to it, but it's not even established doctrine. There are illustrations and there are past representations of Muhammad that nobody was concerned about. Nobody raised any concerns, or they weren't nearly as ferocious. And that tells you something. There's been a change in their willingness to be activist about this issue through the last 30 years since the Rushdie incident. So to me, it was, yes, they might believe that it's wrong to represent Muhammad, but are they re-offended about that, or they actually have an ulterior goal, which is everyone around us has to obey our religious doctrines, which I think is really what went on in that case. And it's a dishonest argument in my view.
So there's actually nothing in the text of Islam that says these things.
Well, people will tell you that that's an interpretation of what the doctrine is. But then you find cases in the past of people representing Muhammad that didn't raise any eyebrows. And so the question is, well, are you enforcing this selectively? Because if you are, why now? What makes this particularly bad? And it's not clear that a cartoon is worse than other things. And I think it's because there's a kind of increased confidence or boldness among the sort of, and I don't think it's a Muslim-wide issue. I think it's among the activists who believe in the kind of jihadist Islamist worldview, which is a subset, I think. And they're the ones who would take up guns and go into the office of Charlie Hebdo and shoot people for it. Now, there are people who will hold up signs in the streets. That's a different level. And then there's a whole bunch of people who don't care. I mean, I remember being in high school in the UK when the Salman Rushdie thing happened, and there were people burning books in the streets. And I remember one of my best friends who was a Muslim who'd read the Quran back and forth and memorized it, and his attitude was, who cares? He told me, I read the Satanic verses, big whoop. I mean, it didn't impress him one way or the other. So there's a kind of activist subset, which I think has become more vocal, more confident in their ability to get appeased, which is what they want.
Yeah. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.